So good morning, everybody.
Morning.
I hope that you are energized and ready to go, and we're going to try to give you an idea or two or inspire some thought. You know, that's kind of why we come to these things, is the opportunity to connect, network, but also to hopefully take away a pragmatic idea or two that we can take back to our campus. This morning we're gonna tell a story, and my friend and colleague Donde Plowman, who's the Vice Chancellor of the University of Nebraska and formerly the Dean of the College of Business there, is gonna tell you about why your work matters. And if we can take you on that journey this morning, that would be great. So we're going to reserve a little bit of time at the end for questions. Hopefully we'll have an answer or two, or at least some feedback or experience that we had. But Donde, would you start us off talking about this project?
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I already connected with a few of you in the audience, and I know the you back at Nebraska, and you're my partner there. So thank you very much for being here. I want to start by saying I think most of what we know about building buildings is wrong. Now, I may have just offended everyone in the room, but let me repeat that. I think most of what we know about building buildings is at least partially wrong. And what we want to do today is talk about when a building is actually more than a building. And I want to tell the story. It's really a story I share with John because he was a partner in this. But the story of building a building at the University of Nebraska. I think most of the times when we think about building a building, my person back at Nebraska is Rick, and Rick should be sitting here in this audience. He is you. He was my other partner. But usually I think when we start these projects of a new building, we think of it as it's about contractors and subcontractors and schedules and flow charts and budgets and metrics and deadlines and time frames and all those tasks that are involved in creating the next beautiful facility that we're so passionate about. And of course, it's partly about that. But I also want to talk, my part of this story today is talk about my experience in building a building where it became about so much more than just a building. So let me begin by showing you, this is what our dream was. This was an early rendering of what came to be known as Hawks Hall. And yes, we had schedules, and yes, we had time frames, and we had budgets, and we had deadlines. But the main thing we had was a dream, and we had no idea, I think, when we undertook this building, what it was going to do for us. The building of this building changed who we were as a community, not just the College of Business. So I was Dean of the College of Business. I arrived there in 2010. And immediately, I say this kind of lovingly, but when I interviewed for the job, I looked at the facility and said to myself, you have to be kidding. But you don't say that on a job interview. I wanted to get the job. So after I got there, we began a process of thinking about a strategic plan, and we began to think about what would it mean and what would be the value of a new facility for us. So we actually built this building, and we've got the pictures to show you. This is the actual building of that same view that you just saw there. The architects were Roberson, and we were so benefited by partnering with Advent and John's folks. But let me just say, I want to step back and tell the story behind that beautiful building that we opened in 2018, this summer, past summer. When we started this project, it was completely privately funded, by the way, $84 million building. We had zero money. We had no money. And the Chancellor and the President said, you're going to have to find the money, Donde. And when I would turn away, they would roll their eyes to their friends and say, yeah, we'll see if she can do it, kind of thing. So I didn't really have the support of the Chancellor and the President. The Chancellor has publicly said, when she first came to me with this idea, I said she was crazy. And he said at the end, actually, it turned out I was crazy. So we had no support for it. We had no money. And it even gets worse. We had no history. The college had no history of really connecting with its alums and no history of fundraising. In a 6.5-year period, we raised the $84 million. We raised a total of $150 million. So we went from 0 to 150 in the context of a world that said it can't be done. So what really happened here? Let me just say that when I started at Nebraska, I think we were in sort of a dark period. The college, I used to describe it as kind of a wilted plant. And the faculty had kind of, okay, so for effect, we use a dark screen. We were in a dark period. The faculty had lost confidence in themselves. People felt like, you know, I went to a great school, but I wish we could be a great school. We'd kind of lost connection to who we were. And we'd absolutely lost connections with our alums and with our donors. And yet, our donors were out there doing great things. For example, 3 of our alums, these guys started Huddle. Anyone heard of Huddle? If your children play high school football, they're all using, they own 98% of the market in digital uploading of film that coaches then cut up, splice, send back to students. And I mean, Huddle does that and sends back to the athletes and says, watch how many times you missed that tackle. And it shows only the tackles they missed. This is now a huge business, and yet we were not telling our story. So I like to think about it as this building was a way of kind of watering that plant and turning on the lights. At the very time after I started there, we started a strategic plan, and we got somebody to help us think about, we didn't have a tagline, so a firm that we were using there locally said, you know, you guys are starting a lot of things, because we were starting to think about how can we be better, and so we started using this tagline called Start Something. And at the same time, at that very moment, we were going into the Big Ten. And I see my Big Ten counterpart from Northwestern right there, and I'm sure some of the other schools are, any other Big Ten schools here? Okay, so it was, to say the least, a little bit overwhelming to think about going into the Big Ten and measuring our little business school up against some of the best business schools in the country. So the truth was, we had to think about how are we going to do this? And what happened with the building project, it became such a confidence booster. And it seems counterintuitive, because you think, you're going to raise $84 million, you're unknown, you're disconnected with your alums, how's that going to work? It worked because, in part, in partnering with John and his colleagues, one day John said to me, Donde, have you read the book David and Goliath by Malcolm Gladwell? I had mentioned that I love Malcolm Gladwell. Has anyone read any of his books? Okay. So his story about David and Goliath actually became kind of our story, and it was a story we told. That David should never have been able to defeat that giant. He was small, he was a kid, he was weak, he had no armor. And yet what David did to achieve this most improbable success was turn his very weaknesses into his strength. And so, yeah, he was small, but he was quick. And all he needed was that sling and that stone. And one stone did it. And we began to use that as a metaphor. In fact, I had a luncheon with a lot of wealthy people, gave every single one of them a copy of that book and said, I need you to help me. You're going to be my stone. And actually, we had a little stone set on the table. Every single one of them, okay, a little cheesy, but they loved it. That was our motto, Start Something. And from there, we took off, trying to invite people into our dream. One of the things we learned about Nebraskans, if you're going to talk about fundraising, they're not very impressed by, oh, we could put your name on a big banner. Nebraskans, like many Midwesterners, and my friends from Illinois and the other states can attest to this, they're humble, and they have a reticence about drawing attention to themselves. So going out and saying, will you help me fund this project, and I'll put your name on a classroom, didn't really appeal to them very much. So I began to talk about, with the help of John and some of his colleagues, the Nebraska way of doing things. And that included, you know, Nebraskans are hardworking, they roll up their sleeves and work, they're humble, but they're confident, they're patient, they have values. And the truth is, constantly I would run into people who would say, all these successful people from Nebraska, but you may not have heard about them. Well, you've heard about Warren Buffett. Every single one of them espoused his values. And so you would hear people saying, can you imagine a kid from Grant, Nebraska, or from Gothenburg, Nebraska, and they've got a big fortune. And so we began to tell that story, and I asked those humble Nebraskans to help me do this. So I guess the thing I want to share with you is that when we built Hawks Hall, We tapped into what was on the hearts and minds of all these people that had been our alums. And in doing that, we began to recognize all these communities that we'd lost touch with. So building the building became our way of recapturing, and making ourselves more exciting to prospective students. Our existing students, they didn't get to move into the building, but they helped us plan it. Our alums are so proud. There's a huge image of those huddle guys up there in our building. And I asked one of them, John, who's on the right, what do you think, how do you like that picture? Did we get your permission? He goes, you didn't tell me it was going to be so big. But then he says, but I got my mom to come see it, and we took a picture together. It created this sense of pride and actually finally a sense of community. So what I've learned from this, if you think about Hawks Hall, and there they are. If you think about Hawks Hall, it's so much more than just a building where we teach classes and where we recruit students. This building helped us figure out again who we were as a community and also who we aspired to be. So when I think about those positions that you're in, it's so important. And if there's any way you can help the people you're working with think about how a building can become more than just a building. It creates a sense of momentum for us. It gave us a new confidence. Everybody on campus now is bringing everyone to that building. Every prospective student, regardless of what they think they want to study, comes in there. Every prospective athlete. I mean, hey, we do everything we can to recruit athletes to where it's cold, and they want to play ball at a place that has a bad record. So everybody comes over there. So I want to encourage you that when you introduce a building project, just remember that buildings are about so much more than a building. And for us, we've only just begun. And what happened was, I'll leave you with this quote that one of our donors said at our big gala where we were celebrating, and all the 84 million's been raised, okay, we're done with that. But he looked at the crowd, and he was one of the major donors, and he said to all his alumni donor friends, we're at halftime of the biggest game we've ever played, and we got to go out and win the second half. So the potential for so much more fundraising, so much more engagement is huge there. And it would never have happened if people like you hadn't partnered with deans like me and people like John to help make that happen. John, I'm going to turn it over to you.
So first of all, how can you not be excited hearing Donde talk about this building and this story? And you know, I think we just kind of humbly wanted to come to you and offer you the perspective of, you know, your stakeholders. Right? You have project leaders who represent the dean of the College of Business, metaphorically. And they're asking you to get this metaphorical bride to the church on time, right? Get this building complete, probably on time, under budget, with things like what Donde was describing, value engineering going on along the way. But occasionally, you're going to come across what our firm calls a visionary like Donde. And you're going to realize that you've got to really bring it. And so it's going to be about more than just LEED certifications and energy efficiency and effective programming for the building. Your job will be to help them succeed, to make them look good, and to get through the roadblocks and the politics and realize that all ships rise on a project like this. So one of the themes that I've mentioned to you, I've met with some of you over the years and spoken to some of you, is related to what Donde is saying, and that is this question of why do we build buildings? We often think about projects in terms of those functional requirements. But if you hear Donde talk about this building is symbolic. There's some pretty prestigious buildings in Europe that you know of that, you know, they don't have fancy buildings, and yet somehow they're able to be successful. So it's more than just the facilities that are creating something that is present and meaningful. The real reason that we build buildings is because the building communicates something about who we are. The real reason we build buildings is because the building communicates something about who we are. And I would just challenge you, when presidents or chancellors or deans on your campuses announce a new building, read the press release that's sent out by the university. Because they'll mention square footage, but they'll be quick to mention what this building will mean to this campus. So the thought is, how do we be intentional about capturing that meaning in the process? And Donde talked about, the audiences that she was considerate of. She talked about the fact that she had lost a little bit of the connection with those audiences. And what I would just tell you is the building initiative is a great way to reconnect emotionally. In many respects, fundraising will be a byproduct of that. Don't you think it'll be an outcome?
I think the building was an outcome, in a way, of
Yeah.
all of that. I say this all the time. People didn't really give to the building. They gave to the dream and the story, which John helped me understand that. I'll be honest with you.
You hear stories like the guys from Huddle who founded that, and what you realize is there is a community that really wants to unite behind a building. They just need to be reached out to. And when we first met Donde and her team, that Robert Stern rendering that you saw really was all
That's
you
all
had.
we had.
And you can go so far with that rendering, but you've got to find some other strategies, and you've got to find ways to pull in those stakeholders and those key audiences into the process. I once met with one of your peers at the University of Texas, and he said, there's no one on the planet who will give money to fund the HVAC system of a building. No one wants the HVAC system named after them. But the line of work that we're in, where we capture these moments of experience within the building and try to put some soul into the building, that's where donors will step behind and fund it. So let me share with you why this is so important. The Gallup organization, who are Nebraska folks, have consistently done a study of some of your bosses, your supervisors. They've done a study of university presidents and chancellors, and in essence, the thesis of that study was, what keeps you up at night? And the convergent data was around one problem. The problem was differentiation. They couldn't find in the sea of competitiveness, in the sea of ubiquity, something that made their university different and special. And so that's where the challenge becomes. Because if you believe the fallacy that if we build the latest and greatest and put the latest and greatest finishes and technologies and benefits and features in that building, we will achieve the vision. When we tour colleges of engineering across the country, we'll look in those sometimes chicken wire glass windows, and we'll look in and we'll see a laboratory, we'll see some sort of simulation workshop, but what that isn't telling you on the tour is really the outcome and what alumni over the years have accomplished in this College of Engineering. So stories are what differentiate you. Stories like the Huddles guys. And what you've got to do is look for ways to set your university apart. So because we, as a firm, we say we design experiences that move people, Donde, we've had to look at, well, who are the audiences we're trying to move on behalf of our clients, and what do they respond to? So for the second year in a row, we've done a longitudinal study of prospective students to decide, to understand how they decide, how they approach that college choice decision. And just because some of you are wired this way, here are the stats of what we've done with this study. We partnered with Dr. Darren White at the Samford Brock College of Business in Birmingham. And he did a nationwide study, 2,000 respondents, non-athletes, half male, half female, stratified sample that matched the college constituencies across the U.S. And Darren says this. He said, we found that the quality of the eduscape is the most important tangible driver of high school students' perception of the college brand, and thus indirectly influences whether a high school student will utilize the college brand in their public persona. Now, Donde, no offense, but that's kind of some PhD gobbledygook there. And so
big words in there.
I'd like to break that down for you. When a millennial buys a pair of Tom shoes, they're only in part buying that pair of Tom shoes because they want the utility and the style of Tom shoes. They're buying it in part because the story of Tom shoes, give a pair, get a pair, fits their personal persona. And we do the same thing. If you're going to a high-level meeting with your president or chancellor, and he or she said, pick up some coffee for us along the way, you would be faced with the choice of stopping at McDonald's, or you would be faced with the choice of stopping at Starbucks. And that choice would have little to do with product utility and features, and would have a lot to do with how you personally identify with that brand because of what it says about you. What Dr. White's research is showing is that's how students choose, is their personal persona. And he says that the driver of drivers in college choice behavior is the academic facility. So let me start with what Donde mentioned and just punctuate it here. This is why a building is more than a building. We are going to have an executive summary of the study that we can hand out to you, but this is important. What you do matters, and this building is a driver of that. And Dr. White came up with this concept of the eduscape. And the reason this is so important is if you know about services marketing, where instead of delivering a product, a consumer product like Tom's Shoes, you go into a servicescape like Starbucks, or you go into a servicescape like the Apple Store. All of the data shows you that servicescape contributes to purchase behavior. It's really important. It validates and upholds this sense of promise. And so what Dr. White's study says that academic facilities' perceptions provide the reason why a person, in this case a prospective student or donor, should believe the truth claims that the institution makes. The facility provides.
I'm going to add one thing to that.
Yeah.
Also, we're in the business of recruiting faculty, and the same thing applies, exactly what you said.
Well, it's interesting because, we do some work with, we do a lot of work with college sports teams, but we do some work with professional sports teams as well. And when we started doing work with professional sports teams, I had the wrong belief, the false belief, that you could not motivate millionaire NFL players by their environment.
Yeah, I would have thought the same thing.
And when we've gone in and decorated the Cowboys locker room or put exhibitry in and around the Titans facility or the San Jose Sharks facility, what we found out was, indeed, it would come out in a Sports Illustrated article, one of the leading scorers for the San Jose Sharks says, what the ownership team did to invest in this facility says a lot about their commitment to me. So, another way of saying this kind of building provides the reason why is this crude analogy, and I'm a little bit of a marketing nerd, so you'll have to forgive me. This one maybe can be helpful to you. So Snickers decided that they would hold on to the brand promise of satisfies. That would be the word, the attribute that they would want to reinforce to their audiences. Satisfies. In fact, if you pick up a Snicker bar and look on the back, the word satisfies is on there. Now that's really important. That's their promise. But just like the building delivers the promise of the college or university in the way that it expresses the narrative and the story, what delivers the promise for Snickers, you know what it is? It's the peanuts. And every time they show that candy bar, they show you the peanuts. The peanuts validate the promise. And so what I want to encourage you to do is think about, are your buildings validating the promise? So our assignment is to take some of these stories and the emotion that Donde has described and to think about programming into the space those touchstones. And what's interesting is when we do a rendering or a design like this, it's coming from the stories that we've collected, but more than the rendering that Stern gave to Donde and her team, we're giving them these touch points inside the building.
One of the things you see right here on that wall right there, that screen, is a screen that shows every donor's name. Same size font. There's 1,521 of them. And that's so Nebraskan, is that you don't see big font, assuming that's big donors. Now, there are other places we recognize the biggest one. But we're very proud of the fact that, and it constantly scrolls, every single donor's name, same size, same font.
And I think that finding those ways to put and infuse that emotion around our firm, we talk about the fact that when we come up with a concept like this to express the story within the building, you know, the only thing that we've damaged in coming up with a concept like this is a few sheets of paper, yeah. Right? Or some markers or some digital content. So just like RAMSA is doing with the renderings of the building, we're providing these concepts to make an emotional connection. And what happens is they become the exhibitry and the storytelling pieces. So I just remind you again what your friend at the University of Texas said, and that is it's difficult for someone to get emotionally behind the HVAC system, even though that's a huge percentage of your budget. But these type storytelling pieces will draw in donors, stakeholders, community, but they will also serve that prospective student, and because this becomes the emotion. Right. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, let me just say also what you're looking at here is, here's an interesting problem we had. We ended up, you know, when you go into fundraising, the professionals tell you you're going to get one super big gift and another kind of big gift, and then, you know, ours didn't follow that pyramid at all. We ended up with 5 gifts that we didn't have something to name that was commensurate with it. We didn't have 5 auditoriums, okay? So we had 5 gifts that were over $7 million. And so at the end of the whole process, and we had one big space and we sold it early for too little. So we ended up at the end of the day saying, okay, these folks have been the pillars of this building. And so what you see is sort of 4 big pillars and then the main gift. So typically, people don't give a lot of money for, you know, a picture somewhere. Our traditional thinking is it's got to be a room, an auditorium, a wing, a whatever. It just didn't turn out that way. So this was really creative. These donors are very happy with this, sort of representing these huge pillars in what we did. The other thing I would say is that we, as we were going through this process, one of the things I learned is that you don't pull people into your dream without connecting somewhere at an emotional level with them. We began doing all these things in the college to try to become a little bit more like Kellogg, okay? Our aspirants in the Big Ten. We started hiring new faculty, excellent faculty. We started new programs, an honors program. We started summer programs to get more minority students, you name it. We were doing everything. But as John just said, when you're doing it inside an old facility, no one's going to take you seriously. So one of the things we ended up doing was we just really tried to pull people in to help us build this college, which ended up being about building this building. When we got to the point where we were going to raise the last beam, yeah. I don't know if we're ready for me to talk about that.
Absolutely.
So we also celebrated every landmark. This was the old building. We had all 200 donors in a room. We were going to celebrate raising the last beam. We'd all signed it. It was actually too windy that day in Nebraska. We had to wait till the following Monday, but we were all there. And we had donors speak, and we had an undergraduate student. This was part of what was going on. We had an undergraduate student, the last speech before we played this video that I'm going to share with you, who told the donors in a heartfelt way, thank you for what you've done. You have lifted this college. You've lifted all of us. And then we played this video. We gave an honorary doctorate, that's one of our faculty members, an honorary doctorate to a guy here from NYU, one of our alums. And we're so proud of our graduates. That's really what it's all about. So when we showed this video, I kid you not, the lights came up and there was not a dry eye in the place. There were 3 billionaires there I saw weeping. One of them we got more money out of later. I'm just telling you. And I said to my 27-year-old son was there, and he said later, Mom, that was kind of cheesy. I said, you know what? It wasn't made for you. And it accomplished our purposes. And actually, that's a great example, John, of how that project became about building that community that was there that day. And their affirmation that, you know what? This college is going to be better because we're going to help them do this building.
I'm going to close with some takeaways, but before we do that, if we could bring the house lights up just a moment. What questions do you have for Donde about this process? What could we answer for you that we may have left out or skipped over? This is the time for you to participate. So Who has a question?
I just want, does Nebraska not have alumni relations or a donor relations?
It's a great
No, we do.
question.
It had just, in our college, had become a little dormant, and honestly, up until my arrival there, it had been heavily focused on athletic donors. So the good news is, the flip side of we haven't done much is, there had been no asking for academics. To me, that was low-hanging fruit. It had all been about athletics. So that change has happened. And I did have 4 professional fundraisers who were helping me. But they had been going about it in kind of just weird ways. Like, here's a list of the same 25 people we talk to all the time. That doesn't get you $150 million.
Other questions?
They've changed now.
Other questions?
So the guy dancing there, Rick Barrera, he normally would be here. He was for the College of Business, our facilities person. And one of the things I meant to say also is that our whole team, the facilities staff, the construction, the general contractor, all the subcontractors, it became like this big family event, this big sense of community.
Other questions? So as you're thinking of those questions, one of the things that we brought for you was an executive summary of the college choice study from Dr. Darren White at Samford, and I think my folks are going to hand those out while you're thinking of those questions, because we're waiting you out here. Maybe.
Yeah.
What was the process you went by to select the architect?
Not a great one. Our university has a system for doing it. So and I had a big role in that. And I, honestly, that's where a little bit of parochialism set in. I had to push really hard to get an important thing, put in the RFP what you want in the architect. So I had put in there, I wanted an architect that had experience building business schools. And they then teamed up with a local Nebraska firm. So that's kind of how it worked. And the thing I want to say also about the work that Advent did for us, one of the things we said to John is we want to be able to tell the story of who we are in this building so that when a prospective student and their parents walk through that building on a weekend, they don't need a tour guide. And you saw some flashes of that, and that's actually what happens. Now, if you walk through that building, you see, students can see all sorts of different groups that maybe I could be part of that group. We have a whole, the grill this is one of my favorites. When I showed, this was a former academic All-American. One of the things you may not know about Nebraska is we have more academic All-Americans than any university in the country. We have 330. The next closest is Notre Dame, and we beat them by 78. And after that, I don't remember if it's Princeton or Stanford. So that's a well-kept secret. We're proud of that. Rob Stuckey was a graduate of ours, and he has a Harvard MBA, very successful financier in the East Coast. When I showed him the renderings that Advent had given us of we want to accentuate the theme about athletics because we have 25% of the athletes studying the college, he was all in and gave us a very nice gift, and we honored him. And he used his picture when he was in the school in the 70s.
What's so interesting to me is, as an outsider, when we met Donde and her team, they had the couple of views that Ramsa had provided them with, but they had so much more. She's alluding to it, and it through a discovery and what we call a story mining process. These emotional connection points started coming up. And what we realized is she has plenty of weapons in the arsenal to be able to bring this building to life in making those connection points. And so it really is, you kind of sketch up a concept of how to emotionally engage someone like this student athlete that she was talking about, and you draw them in that way. And it becomes a very efficient process. What we're doing is creating donor inventory for you. And we were talking about this morning. I hate to break it to you, but that model that you all have of kind of having a donor inventory list, of rooms and spaces, please forgive me, but that's just broken.
And
There's no
it
family.
absolutely is.
There's no family on the planet who wants conference room number 4 named after them. They haven't worked their whole life, built their wealth for you to name conference room number 4 after them. And even though it's pragmatic, you've got a piece of inventory there, the better thing is to find a way emotionally to draw in that donor But just as Donnie is saying, this becomes a touch point on the tour without a docent, without a tour guide on weekends that further tell the story that then satisfy the Dr. White study, which is it's part of that eduscape, where a student is using their personal persona to identify with this athletic, academic All-American.
I would also say, let's take Rob Stuckey as an example. One of the traditional broken myths about fundraising is that professional fundraisers say you're never going to get $1 million out of someone who hasn't given you $1,000. Or you'll never get $10 million if they haven't given you $100,000. We broke that rule over and over and over again. When I met with Rob Stuckey, I left it in Washington, D.C. He works at Carlisle. I left the meeting and told the foundation people, I can usually get people to talk to me. I can kind of draw them out. It was the worst meeting I'd ever had with anyone. He was like, I went to Harvard, how's your MBA? It felt like that. I left there and said, well, this guy had no contact with the school. The fundraisers went back with the pictures of the idea about the sports representation, and he gave us a huge gift. He had not only had no involvement, he'd never given 5 cents. And that happened over and over and over again. It wouldn't had we not tapped into kind of the story, the heart and soul of what was really buried there in that college.
The emotion. Any other questions? Yes.
At UNC, we're just kicking off a project for new building in our business school. Maybe you could share a couple of lessons learned or things you might have done.
Big lessons learned, don't do a price list and name all your rooms and say, atrium, $5 million. Because here's what happened to us. This is true story. One day, I get a call from the fundraiser early on. We had that list published. She said, are you sitting down? We had no money. She said, we just got a gift for $5 million. I said, who from? Never heard of them. They drove up, heard about the project, said they're from Arizona. They want to honor their father. They looked at the list, said, oh, a $5 million. Okay, we'll take the atrium. So we were thrilled when we did that, because at that point, we had maybe $20 million raised. After the fact, that space could have been, we could have used it for a lot bigger. So that's one thing. The price list, and it doesn't inspire people. That's one thing I would say. I'd say the second thing is I would encourage them to think about the story. And it's not just about, marble and granite and limestone. And you really get, and which kind of wood. You get caught up in that. And that's a part of it. But it needs to tell that story of Chapel Hill Business School, which is an amazing business school. I assume you're talking about Chapel Hill, UNC, yeah. Something about the heart and soul and the spirit of who they are. I would pass that on.
Other questions? Okay, let me offer you just really quickly some takeaways that may be helpful for you. First of all, realize that eduscape is number one for prospective students. What you do is really meaningful. Again, if you want a more expanded copy of this study other than the executive summary, you let me know, but this was one to turn into the university president or the university chancellor. Just validating the work that you do and the leadership that you provide. Secondly, looks matter. This is the generation that you're recruiting as prospective students are called centennials by the Futures Group. Some people call them Generation Z. They've had a camera on them since the day they were born. They're digital natives. Looks matter, and this kind of look and feel is part of how they decide. 2 buildings in the study rise above all others in importance when a prospective student is choosing. One is the College of Business, and the other is the Student Center. Those 2 rise important. And the other thing is realize that eduscape is only going to increase in importance. We've put so much emphasis in our society on packaging and presentation that it's only going to increase. And I would just encourage you, make it your goal, as Donde is saying, to invoke those strong emotional connections. Just remember my analogy that part of what you're able to do with that Snickers bar is use those emotions to reinforce and fulfill the promise that the university is making. And then make the space worth sharing. This is an Instagrammable, tweetable generation, and they're looking for those touchstones, those visual imagery within the building to be able to send out to their social community. And then lastly, just like their preceding generation, the millennials, the centennials are all about belonging. But even more than that, those guys from Huddle want to belong too.
That's right.
That's an extraordinarily telling story, and I hope you didn't miss it earlier when Donde said to the Huddle founder, you know, did we get your permission to use the photo? And he said, well, it's really big, but I took my mom
To see it.
to see it.
One last thing I would like to say to each of you, and kind of back to your question is, you know, you're working with people like me who have no idea what they're doing in building a building. That's the truth. I tell this story, I never even remodeled a kitchen. I always heard if you did a remodel of your house, you'd get a divorce. So I've never done any of that. But you're working with deans and vice chancellors who honestly, this is the first and only project they'll ever do. So they really need your guidance on the whole building and not just the piece of it that you know so well. So I just encourage you to nudge them, and I think they'll be open to it. And they need your help, and you can have a lasting mark bigger than what might have been, if you think about that.
I just remind you, what you do matters. The buildings are so much more than just a structure. Thank you for your attention and your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John and Donde.